Well, hello, fungi friends. Welcome to episode 5 of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about my approach to cooking and preserving mushrooms, and this will sort of include an overview of like what I do when I get home, have a bunch of mushrooms, and they're dirty, or maybe when I get home from the market and I have cultivated mushrooms and they're pretty clean. So we'll talk about sort of the first steps to take when you got your mushrooms, how to process them. I'm going to talk about some of my basic approach to just how to cook and taste a mushroom for the first time, and then some more advanced techniques for how I like to kind of maximize the particular aspects of a certain mushroom, depending on the way I cook it, the way I prepare it, what kinds of dishes I put it into. And then I'm going to get into some aspects of preserving mushrooms, whether dry them, or cook and freeze, or candy. There's a huge array of possibilities that you can go through, and far be it from me to tell you everything you could possibly do. But I'm going to try to sum up as much as I can, kind of give you just some of my thoughts and approaches to cooking mushrooms and trying to get the best out of them when you bring them home, because it can be quite a lot of work to go out and find them. And it's really a shame if you have something go bad in the fridge, which has happened to me plenty of times, and I always feel kind of guilty about it. But I've been working over the years to get better and better at using absolutely everything I bring home. Because if you're going to take it out of nature, you have a responsibility to do something with it, to make good on the fact that you plucked something out of the ground. It's kind of like the idea of head to tail eating with animal husbandry, that if you're going to kill an animal, you might as well use it all. I feel the same way about mushrooms, very much so, that if you're going to pick something, you have a responsibility to use it. So let's hop into it. I'm going to sort of talk here, just the first step, about cleaning mushrooms. So mushrooms you pick in the wild are generally grown out of the ground or on dead wood, and either way, they've probably got some dirt on them. Very, very rarely you will find an absolutely pristine, perfect mushroom that has absolutely no dirt on it. And in those situations, maybe I would consider just taking that mushroom straight out of the ground and putting it in a pan. But what happens when you're out foraging is you put that mushroom in your basket or a bag or some other carrying device, and there's other mushrooms in there, and there's dirt, and it gets dirt on it. So inevitably, when you get home, your mushrooms have some dirt on them. And I vehemently disagree with that point of view, because mushrooms, like I said, grow on the ground. They tend to be dirty. And if you don't wash them, you really can't get the dirt off. I have spent early on in my mushroom career, I remember getting chanterelles and spending hours sitting there brushing them and rubbing them with like a sort of a moist towel, trying to get all the dirt off. And what I realized was we didn't do a very good job of getting all the dirt off, because they still taste like dirt. And chanterelles always do to some degree. Chanterelles are not my favorite, but they're earthy. It's because there's usually dirt in them. And then the reason to not wash them was because there's sort of this idea that somehow washing them will waterlog them, and then you'll never get them nice and brown and crispy in a pan. And as I found out, even after doing all this work to very diligently and carefully, clean off every little speck of dirt we could get off in a chanterelle, and then cook them in a pan, they turned into a watery mess anyhow. And that's because fresh mushrooms are mostly water. They carry a ton of water. And there's really nothing wrong with getting a mushroom wet, because that's what they do in nature. They sit and get rained on and expand and contract depending on the amount of moisture that's available. And so the structure of a mushroom can easily accommodate water. It can get completely soaked, or still be pretty dry inside. And either way, when you go to cook it, it's going to release most of the water that it has in it. So it doesn't matter if you get it wet, because that water is going to come out. And I think the important thing to think about here is how people cook mushrooms. Because again, the traditional advice, and this is a very sort of Julia Child-esque view of how to cook mushrooms, is that you aren't supposed to crowd the pan. And it's, I guess, sort of similar to the idea of how you would cook meat, right? That you're putting it in hot fat and you're trying to brown it. Problem is, most mushrooms have so much water that if you put them directly into fat, the Well, the fat gets absorbed immediately by mushrooms because mushrooms are a little sponge. And once the fat gets absorbed into the mushroom, then the water that's in that mushroom can never fully cook out. And this is regardless of whether you crowd the pan or if the pan's at the right temperature. If you have wild mushrooms, they're going to have water in them. Specifically, I'm talking about chanterelles here too, because this is the thing. Again, I see a lot of people misunderstanding is they think you shouldn't wash them, and they put them in a pan with hot fat, and then the fat soaks in the mushroom, and the water never cooks out, and you end up with this like slippery, insipid mushroom that never really reaches its full potential. And so, what I like to do with all wild mushrooms and even a lot of cultivated mushrooms, that cultivated mushrooms are generally not going to be as wet because they're not waterlogged. They're not going to be as dirty, so you don't necessarily need to wash them. Maybe a brush off with a towel is fine. But I'll do what's called a dry fry or dry saute, and that's I just take a pan. I usually use nonstick, but cast iron works great. A normal ionized steel pan would work just fine too. And I'll bring it up to about medium high temperature, and throw all my mushrooms in. And I don't worry about crowding the pan because I'll throw an entire cutting board full of mushrooms into the pan and just let them sit there. I'll add a little bit of salt, and I'm gonna point of doing this is to draw out the water, draw out as much water as possible. And sometimes, if you have really wet mushrooms like chanterelles or porcini, or any number of these wild mushrooms that are sitting out there in the rain, there'll be quite a bit of water that comes out of them, and they kind of turn into a soup. And that's alarming at first because you're like, oh no, all these beautiful mushrooms I picked, which seem so pristine, are now just this like goopy soup. And that's okay. All that liquid is the liquid that was in the mushrooms, and you're using the heat from the pan to dry that liquid off and concentrate that flavor. And a lot of people ask me like, hey, should I pour that liquid off? And I personally think no, because that's where a lot of the flavor of the mushroom is. What you want to do is cook it down so that water all disappears, and you're concentrating the flavor of the mushroom back into the mushroom rather than pouring out the liquid. There's even some mushrooms, like I said, porcini is actually one where I like to add a little bit of water to the pan to start. So about a quarter inch of water in with a bunch of chopped up porcini. And I do that because it's going to turn into soup, and I'm actually facilitating it to kind of like turn into soup faster and then blow off all the water. Doing that with porcini also helps because I find a lot of king boletes to actually be quite bitter. And if I do that step of adding a little bit of water and cooking them down, then I find them less bitter. And I actually, in that situation, I wipe the fond out of the pan because the brown bits are where a lot of the bitterness is for me. So once I've rendered all that water out, I will wait for the mushrooms to just start barely sticking to the pan. And that's when I'll go ahead and add fat. And this is partially why I like to cook a lot of mushrooms in non-stick, because it is easier if they start sticking to the pan to just add a little fat, and they'll come right off if it's a non-stick. If it's a steel pan or something like that, they can stick a little bit more. It still works just fine. Mushrooms are pretty robust. And when you cook them down for a long time like that, you sort of set the texture. And I think, again, getting back at the idea of like, you're not supposed to wash mushrooms. Well, that's a misnomer, because what you should not be doing is putting mushrooms directly into fat in a pan. You should be doing this dry fry step, cooking all the water out. That way you set the texture of a mushroom because it loses most of its water. It gets a really nice meaty chew. And then you put fat back in the pan, which makes it crispy, helps accentuate the flavor, and add some richness back to those mushrooms in a very sort of necessary way, because mushrooms have zero fat, so they're really good at soaking up fat. But again, if you add fat before the water's cooked off, then you get the slippery, wet mushroom, and I think that's the texture that a lot of people are really turned off by when it comes to eating mushrooms, because they're just like, oh, like it's a texture thing, I can't do it. And like, well, it's just because someone has cooked mushrooms incorrectly for you. And again, I think most of the recipe books and stuff out there will tell you to put mushrooms to a pan full of butter. That's because they're mostly just working with agaricus bisporus, the button mushroom, portobello, cremini, that kind of thing. And those are okay because they're so dry that if you put them directly in the fat, they will start browning. But again, even with those mushrooms, even with cultivated mushrooms that come home pretty dry, whether it's maitake, lion's mane, agaricus bisporus, whatever it is, I do like to do that initial dry fry step where I develop some of the color on the mushroom. And it seems counterintuitive because almost everything you put in a pan, you put a little oil in first, but you don't need to do that. Brown it first, then add the fat, add the oil, and develop the flavor. And so after I've added, what I like to do is do a dry fry. I'll usually add a little bit of neutral oil, so that's like a canola or a peanut or some sort of high temp vegetable oil that's not going to burn. And then I'll sit there and I'll continue to cook the mushrooms over about medium heat, develop a nice browning on them. You're really developing those umami flavors through Maillard reactions, which are the browning reactions, creates nice caramel, crispy bits on the edge of the mushroom. And so again, with the salting, what I'll do is I'll salt once when I put them in for the dry fry. I'll salt again when I put the neutral oil in. And then often to finish, maybe I'll add like a little knob of butter. And I don't add butter for the long part because butter can burn fairly easily. And whether it's a vegan butter or a dairy butter, there's solids in there that will burn. So I'll add it right at the end, kind of for the flavor. And I'll add a little bit more salt, sometimes even like a finishing salt, to kind of add some texture elements there. And so this is just a very simple saute method, but as with anything simple, there's some great complexity there to how you do it, and it can change a little bit based on the kind of mushroom. Like I said, some commercial mushrooms are completely dry. I will put those sometimes right in the fat, but the majority of wild mushrooms that I know are going to be quite wet, I will very specifically do that dry fry step. And then after doing that sort of saute sequence, I'll often pull those mushrooms out and start building other components of a dish in the same pan. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that there's some mushroom goodness in that pan. And I'll throw in some fat and some onions and some garlic and that kind of stuff and start cooking those down separately. And I know on the side that I have these very, very well cooked mushrooms that have fully developed umami on them. And I'm not just throwing mushrooms into a pan that already has other vegetables in it, because those mushrooms will then kind of stay wet and slippery and never really develop the nice brown flavor and texture you get if you cook them alone. So often in most of the dishes I cook, mushrooms are the very first thing that I cook before anything else. So I'll get those kind of fired off. Then maybe I'll go ahead and cook my meat, brown that in the pan, use onions and garlic and other vegetables, kind of deglaze the pan, and then I'll put all the meat and mushrooms and stuff back together. And in there is a very important point that I really like to cook meat and mushrooms together. And this is sort of a nutritional philosophy as much as it is anything functional. Mushrooms do not have any fat. And because of that, they pair really well with things that have fat. As we've seen in society, people seem to have a weird aversion to fat, which is very much a function of the way that the sugar industry lied to us for a very long time, saying that somehow fat was what was making us fat and not excess calories from sugar being absolutely everything. But as it turns out, fat's actually pretty good for you. And there's some fats that are better for you or fats that are worse for you. But for the most part, we can all handle some level of animal fat or plant fats. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that if you cook mushroom with meat or some form of animal fat, that animal fat often gets poured out as sort of excess stuff. If you cook 2 pounds of ground beef, you always like gross fat, people pour it out. And you're like, well, you had this cow that you fed all this grain to, and then you trimmed all the fat off and poured off excess fat. Like, that fat is nutrition and calories. It represents a huge investment of time and water and resources. So why are you wasting nutrition? If you add mushrooms to that, the mushrooms will soak in that animal fat, and as you're digesting it, because mushrooms are full of complex polysaccharides, they take a long time to break down. So that fat, instead of getting spiked with your blood sugar, if you have high fat and high blood sugar, you incorporate that fat as adipose tissue. But instead, if that fat is bound up in mushroom polysaccharides that are slowly being broken down in the gut, it will get sort of time released. And that is a really effective way to stay full, stay satiated, and maintain your energy level by cooking meat and mushrooms together, or just cooking mushrooms with some fat that will help sort of time release fat into your system as things go on. So that's my philosophy. I think people would benefit massively nutritionally from eating more mushrooms. We'd see levels of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, all sorts of stuff kind of go down across the board because we have increased fiber consumption and probably better absorption of nutrients, and the fact that high of fungal polysaccharides and fiber in our diet would make people eat less and probably eat healthier. I think it also, I've seen some studies where they added, mushrooms to ground beef and cafeteria burgers, and across the board, kids much preferred the burgers that were cooked with some mushrooms. They stay in moisture for longer because mushrooms are better to hang on to water than meat is. So a burger that sat around in the cafeteria thing for a while was vastly improved by the fact that it had some mushrooms in it. So I think that's pretty cool, and I'd certainly like to see more of that. So other than that, really simple kind of pan fried saute, which again I think the dry fry and then slow developing of the browning umami and some oil, and then like a finishing step is a great way to cook a mushroom. But there's a lot of other ways to cook mushrooms that people forget about. So mushrooms don't need to be cooked rare, and I think that's the thing. A lot of people have a weird thing about like, oh, I shouldn't cook all the nutrients out of my mushrooms, right? And it's like, no, 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 no. Mushrooms are much better if you cook them thoroughly. There are multiple mushrooms that are common edible mushrooms that if you kind of just flash them in a pan, you try to do a rare blitz on them, you can still get sick from eating them. Shiitake make people sick every year. Oyster mushrooms make people sick every year. Morels make people sick every year because people are undercooking them. Because there's an assumption somehow that, and I think this comes from vegetables and, maybe raw vegan food stuff, but like people sort of assume that the less you cook something, somehow the more nutrients you get out of it. And that's not always true. Uh, Frequently, the reason we cook something is to make the nutrients in a food more bioavailable. And yes, heat can destroy certain amounts of vitamins and other nutrients, but that doesn't mean that you should eat all your food raw. I mean, many of the vegetables that we eat have oxalic acid in them that can be quite toxic to you unless you apply heat to it. And mushrooms are similar. There are compounds in mushrooms that are perfectly safe to eat if you cook the mushroom thoroughly, but if you kind of just flash in a pan, it can make you sick. So shiitakes contain these lectins, which can really mess you up. Morels, morchella, contain geranymetrin, monomethylhydrazine. That's like a neurotoxin, can really mess you up if you don't cook them thoroughly. And when I say cook thoroughly, I mean like put mushrooms in a pan and give them a solid like 5 to 10 minutes on medium heat. And there's other ways to cook them than just doing that, and that's what I was going to get at. So you can boil mushrooms. There's certain mushrooms that I like to boil and then drain and then cook them separately. So like honey mushrooms are a great example of that. Honey mushrooms are really slippery, and the slipperiness can give people some GI upset. Anything that is, sorry, my computer's giving me, there we go. Anything that is slippery can inherently get you kind of not feeling so great down there. And some people are more sensitive than others. But I find that if you do a boil step, you can dilute some of that slipperiness, all those polysaccharides and stuff that make it really goopy. Some of that goopiness goes out into the water, and then you get a mushroom that's still slippery, but is less likely to make you have any gurgly indigestion kind of feelings. So boiling a mushroom is a great first step. It helps set the texture, and then you can pan fry it or saute it or do something with it afterwards. I like to roast mushrooms, so I'll lay them out on a sheet tray and put a little oil on them, kind of toss them around. This works better with mushrooms that are already sort of dry. Again, if you use a really wet mushroom, you'll have the same problem as if you add oil to a mushroom in a pan. It can be kind of slippery, but there's certain things I like to roast. So like lactarius mushrooms take really well to roasting. Maitake. There's a few things that roasting condenses the texture and makes them kind of crispier on the edge, and I really like that. Usually when I roast, I'll do about 375, 400 for about 20 minutes, something around that. With chicken in the woods actually is a great mushroom that I roast all the time, and especially because the chicken in the woods that I pick here in Napa is on eucalyptus. And so if I don't cook it very thoroughly, there's oxalic acid, and there's also volatiles from the eucalyptus that can make you quite sick. So by putting my chicken in the woods from eucalyptus into an oven, cut fairly thin, dressed with a little bit of oil and salt, I roast that for about 20, 30 minutes. And then I can smell the eucalyptus volatiles blowing off. So I'm left with sort of a dry piece of mushroom, but what I do then is I will dredge and fry it. So I will put it in flour, egg wash, breadcrumbs, and then fry it. And that way I've ensured that my chicken in the woods is cooked all the way through. It is less likely to make it, especially if you are worried at all that a mushroom might make someone not feel so good. And that's a very good approach in general to cooking mushrooms, is cook them thoroughly, try a small amount, see how you feel, and then you can eat more if you're fairly certain that you can robustly consume this mushroom without issue. And the dose makes the poison sometimes. So be aware when you're trying a mushroom for the first time. That's a good idea to kind of cook it thoroughly and just try a small amount without going overboard on eating too much of it, because if you are going to get sick, you're going to get a lot sicker if you eat a lot of that mushroom than if you just have a little bit. And most of the time when I talk about this, like an edible mushroom that would make you sick is going to give you like, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. It's not going to kill you. It's just some uncomfortable GI upset. And this can happen to lots of people with lots of different foods. So it's not necessarily like the mushroom's fault. It can just be your internal system and microbiome may not be able to handle a food for whatever reason. And it may not be all the time either. I know people who've like gotten sick from a mushroom once and then they tried it again years later and they're totally fine. So it just really depends. Like I said, I mentioned frying. Frying is one of my favorite ways to cook and prepare mushrooms because, again, a lot of people dislike that kind of slimy, slippery texture that some mushrooms have, and you can combat that by doing a fry. So, again, whether you pre-cook the mushroom or not, it's kind of up to you. I've seen a lot of things recently where people took oyster mushrooms and dredged them and battered them somehow. And that's, again, you can do a standard like dredge in corn flour or cornstarch or AP flour, whatever kind of like dry thing you want, put it in some sort of egg wash, or you can use just eggs or real eggs, and then put it into like a breadcrumb thing, or you can just straight up make kind of like a fish and chips batter, almost more like a tempura batter that you can dip a mushroom straight into, and then put that right into hot oil. And I do that a lot during the summer, actually, as I'll use kind of a mixture of rice flour and AP flour, and the rice flour gives this nice sticky tackiness to the batter. I'll add a bunch of porcini powder. I'll add maybe some garlic powder. Sometimes I'll add some Korean chili flake. Stuff like that. Porcini powder really adds the umami. So that's my trick. And I add porcini powder to everything. So if you've ever watched my cooking live streams, I'm usually dumping some porcini powder in as kind of my special ingredient. But yeah, doing that either way of frying, whether you're dredging and battering or you're just going straight in the batter, putting in nice hot oil, making sure it gets really good and crisp. It can be a deep fry, it can be a shallow fry, really whatever you want. But frying is a great way to kind of enhance that texture of a mushroom and take away some of that slimy slipperiness you might not like, and instead focus on like this nice crispy crust. And you salt it, and you can then take those fried bits of mushrooms and put them inside of other stuff. Put them in a sandwich, make a taco with them. You can just straight up snack on them. But either way, you're then enhancing the texture elements around a mushroom. Much in a way that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily like the texture of certain meats, but we're so used to having ground meat or having it, fried chicken or something. Like I don't love chicken breast. I think chicken breast sucks. But if you deep fry it and turn it into a fried chicken sandwich, I'm like, oh man, this is pretty good. So just think about how you prepare things has a big influence on what the mushroom is going to taste like and how you perceive it. There's another one that I'm going to mention, and I don't necessarily recommend this, especially not in an adventurous sense, but you can eat a couple mushrooms raw. So Agaricus bisporus, the cremini, the button mushroom. I know people eat those. People are very familiar with eating those raw. I wouldn't eat those raw straight up because our bodies don't have the capacity to really digest chitin on a long time frame. There's some amount of chitin that we can handle, and plenty of people eat raw mushrooms and are totally fine. But I just generally would stay away from it. There's a few wild forage mushrooms that I do like to consume raw. That's like the beefsteak mushroom, butter boletes. There's an amanita or two that I've tried raw, and they can be pretty good. But when I say raw, I really mean like carpaccio or ceviche style. So what I like to do with those mushrooms is you can slice them fairly thinly. I'll dress them up with some like lemon juice or vinegar and olive oil, salt and pepper, maybe a couple of herbs. And I'll kind of toss them around in that mixture and let them marinate for a while. And you'll see the texture of the mushroom will change. It becomes almost cooked like fish would get cooked if it sits in acid for a little while. Some of the water is drawn out. The texture condenses a little bit, and the oil and vinegar and other flavors kind of seep in and make a really nice, tasty mushroom dish. But I do be fairly careful about limiting my consumption of eating a raw mushroom. I wouldn't eat a whole platter of it. I might make a platter for a dinner table, and then everyone can have a little serving of it without eating too much, because eating a lot of raw chitin will just empirically cause some GI upset for you. So I know some people say they eat like an entire thing of button mushrooms, and good on you, but I wouldn't recommend that for everyone because some people are going to feel pretty sick if they do that. So one of the things I like to do in cooking with mushrooms is to build layers of flavor. So like I was talking about, sometimes I'll fry the mushrooms in a pan and I'll pull them out and put in other ingredients and then add the mushrooms back in and build up the layers of flavor on top of like the umami, the fond I've created in the pan from those mushrooms with the actual mushrooms I'm adding. I'll use different kinds of mushrooms to add different textures, different flavors to the dish I'm cooking. And often I will also add fresh and dried mushrooms. So if I'm using something like a morel, like a black trumpet, I will use the fresh mushroom itself in the dish, and I will also rehydrate some of the dried mushrooms that I have and use the rehydrated dried mushrooms in there. So I have two slightly different textures. A lot of mushrooms take on more flavor when you dry them. So I'll also use the liquid from rehydrating those mushrooms and put that into the dish. And that's really phenomenal if you're creating like a cream sauce or some sort of stew or anything with liquid involved, because you can use that liquid, rehydration liquid, to add a lot of flavor. So some mushrooms that take really, really well to drying are specifically ones where the flavor, the umami, is greatly enhanced when they are dried. So that's stuff like morels, porcini, shiitake, black trumpets are all like top tier mushrooms to dry out. Something like a candy cap, which is a small mushroom that you don't really eat fresh. You pretty much only dry them out because then their flavor becomes much stronger. And that's a sort of a mapley flavor. It's not one that you would necessarily put into a pasta dish, but it's phenomenal for using in desserts, infusing into creams and cheesecake and ice cream and stuff like that. Candy caps are some of my favorites. But again, those are ones that you very much need to dry out to kind of maximize their flavor. And, you know, porcini are really good fresh, but they're also really good dried. And their texture doesn't necessarily come back when you rehydrate them, but the flavor gets far deepened when you dry them. And so, you know, I think that's one of the things to kind of consider is there's always a little bit of a trade-off between like, well, texture is usually better fresh, but sometimes flavor is better dried. And it depends on the mushroom and how much of that mushroom is determined. So, you know, do I cook it fresh or do I dry it out? And sometimes it's just, you're like, I have so many mushrooms, I just need to process them and get rid of them. And that's where drying is really nice because you can just take a whole, you know, basket of mushrooms, wash them off, and throw them right into your dehydrator and kind of say, all right, I'm going to bed. I'm not going to deal with this right now. Because, yeah, sometimes at the end of a long day of mushroom hunting, sitting there and actually processing your finds it's a lot of work. It takes a while. And it can be, I find myself up often, you know, at 1, 2 in the morning with a huge pile of mushrooms trying to figure out what to do with them. And that's where, you know, just throwing some stuff in a pan, throwing some stuff in a dehydrator is a good way to just start moving through it. And that's, you know, there's a triage thing that happens as well because there's going to be mushrooms you bring home. You're like, man, you know, boletes and porcini are going to go bad pretty quickly, so I really can't keep them in the fridge that long, especially if they have some bug damage. That's where I'm going to put those directly in the dehydrator, and I'll dry them out and then powder them at a later date. Some other things I might leave in the fridge to cook a little later on in the week. And there's some things that are sort of right on the edge of whether I should cook them immediately because that will stabilize them microbially, spoilage-wise. They're not going to go anywhere once I've cooked them. That way they'll last in the fridge for like a week or two. Whereas if they're fresh, they could get rotten or they could get more bug damage. And there's also, you can cook them and then pack them in a bag or a Tupperware and freeze them. And there's a lot of mushrooms that take pretty well to that because by cooking them, you've driven off the water, you've kind of set the texture, and then freezing it really doesn't have any further impacts on texture. You can thaw them out and use them just as you would when they were sort of freshly cooked. And so for as a preservation method for most mushrooms, that's the way to kind of like keep the best texture is to cook them and then freeze them. If you want to like maximize the flavor, then sometimes drying them is better. But again, you're sacrificing the texture. And there's certain mushrooms that I just don't bother drying out because, you know, something like a Natsutake, which has this incredible ethereal aroma, that aroma goes away when you dry it, and the texture itself is not great when you rehydrate it. So there's really no reason to like dry a Natsutake. But even like cooking and freezing Natsutake doesn't work super well either. So my favorite way to preserve Natsutake is actually to make what I call Natsutake sake. And so I have lots of Natsutake, a lot of them. It's this Tricholoma merulanium, but it has this incredible sort of seafood cinnamon aroma, which is somewhat fleeting. I capture that aroma by filling a jar full of them and then pouring sake over it. And that sake absorbs the flavor into the liquid. And then I'll use that sake for cooking rice, soups, stir fries, stuff like that. And it's really phenomenal to kind of preserve that flavor. So there's, you know, different ways that you would go about preserving different mushrooms. It's very much a function of like what you want to have happen with the flavor and texture. And is there something special about that mushroom that you're trying to maximize or capture by the way that you're preserving it? So you can also can or pickle mushrooms, and I like doing that as well. One of my favorite sort of ways to do that is just take a bunch of mushrooms, make a sort of a court bouillon, but you essentially take like liquid and throw some stuff in it. Flavor it with bay leaf, peppercorn, garlic, thyme, whatever you want. Sometimes I will add some vinegar to that to acidulate, to acidify it a little bit, and that's a food safety thing that I'm going to feel safer about having acidified something that I'm going to can, because I don't necessarily pressure can everything. Sometimes I just take a clean can, boil my mushrooms for 10, 15, 20 minutes in this nice flavorful liquid, and then I'll pack the mushrooms into a jar with some of that liquid, maybe add a little extra vinegar, and then I'll float some oil on top, and that's what's called a conserva. That's a really wonderful way to preserve mushrooms, and adding that little bit of vinegar helps keep the pH low, and I'll keep that in the fridge. It's not shelf stable if I, didn't pressure can it, but it was hot when it went in. It was a hot pack jar, and it will stay microbially stable for up to years in the fridge if it has that low pH and there's like a layer of oil to prevent other things from accessing those mushrooms and growing on them. So that kind of conserva method is something that I do a lot. You can straight up can mushrooms, but then you need to be really careful about cooking them long enough to ensure the spores aren't able to germinate. You need to have really clean cans. You need to like reach a certain pressure, but you can definitely can mushrooms. That's a thing that people do. You can freeze dry mushrooms, and that's one that most people don't have access to, a freeze dryer, but those are pretty cool because that takes away, there's certain mushrooms you don't want to dry out. Like a chanterelle does not dry well because its flavor doesn't improve and its texture gets completely ruined. But if you freeze dry a chanterelle, the texture is preserved, and then you can rehydrate it, and it will be much more similar to a fresh chanterelle. So freeze drying is pretty cool. It's also a way you can very easily powder things from a freeze dried mushroom because they're already kind of like, the same texture as like the astronaut ice cream kind of stuff. Will just crumble. But again, most people don't have freeze dryers. Those are pretty expensive. But it's on the forefront of what we're going to see heading forward as people do more and more mushroom preservation and sharing those methods. So I think it's kind of cool. You can also candy mushrooms. It's a really easy way to do it. You make like a sugar syrup, and there's some certain mushrooms, jelly mushrooms, candy caps. I do it a lot with yellow feet chanterelles, actually, Craterellus tubiformis. Well, I will make sort of a 2-to-1 sugar water syrup. Sometimes I'll use like half white sugar, half brown sugar, a cup of water. I'll add a couple of candy caps to kind of flavor it like maple, and I'll throw a big handful of the yellow feet chanterelle in there and just kind of boil them all until the liquid goes away. You end up with these beautiful, little caramelized, soft, supple mushroom bites that are incredible to put on top of ice cream or put on biscuits with jam. You can use them all sorts of different ways. You can also take them out and slightly dehydrate them where they still have some chew and they're a little bit gummy, and then roll them in sugar and kind of make little mushroom gummy candies. So there's a lot of options out there. You don't have to be limited to just cooking and eating or drying out. You can do some of these other things of like a liquid pack or a canning, a pickling, freeze drying, candying. And also I make a lot of duxelle. So if you have a lot of mushrooms around, you just don't know what to do, cook them down really well in a pan, add some nice umami components, add a little sherry, add some thyme, herbs, this kind of stuff. If you want, you can add cream, but then you can you sort of blitz the whole thing. You can blitz it beforehand or after. Again, it's not super important, but as long as you kind of get all that like mushroom and sometimes allium goodness all together, you can have this umami paste, which you could save as little cubes in the fridge to toss into a soup or a stock like you would like a pesto cube, or you can just save it and like spread it on toast with some cheese and like absolutely phenomenal mushroom toast, or you can use like a beef Wellington. So duxelle is another way, these umami mushroom pastes, another way to use up a lot of mushrooms and really maximize the flavor. So those are just some good preservation methods, easy things you can do to kind of make sure you're taking advantage of it when you come home with. Another favorite thing that I do pretty frequently, this is inspired by a book called The Mushroom Hunter's Kitchen by Chad Hyatt. The link for that is in the FAQ on my website. Chad's book has a lot of really, really good mushroom recipes and sort of non-standard mushroom recipes because he does a whole bunch of different things as well. But one of his things is he makes a mushroom leather. And so he kind of boils makes a flavorful liquid, boils some mushrooms in it. Um, I add onion and a few other things, and he sticks it all in the blender and blitzes it down to a paste, spreads it out on a sheet, throws it in the dehydrator, and you have like mushroom leather, just like you would fruit leather. And it's really phenomenal. You can use virtually any kind of mushroom when you do that. It's really, really tasty. Um, Another good way to just use mushrooms very simply, where you're sort of, again, just cooking some down and into a paste, is to make very, very simple mushroom soups. So you can just take mushrooms, cook them, a little bit of oil in a pan, and you just hit them with a blender. You can add a little bit of stock and turn it into kind of a paste. And from that, you can freeze that and turn it, kind of gussy it up later with some onions and other things, make a little bit more of a soup out of it, or keep it as a very simple soup and serve it as just like a preamble to a meal, kind of a little amuse-bouche thing, or create a little shot, put a flavored oil in it, maybe put a pumpkin seed on there. There's a lot of things you can do, or you can really build up those flavors with like cream and leeks and extra porcini powder and stuff like that. But these are all fairly simple things you can do to bring a lot of extra complexity when you use mushrooms. In that same vein, you can also blitz mushrooms, and depending on the kind of mushroom specifically, you can turn it into like a pate. So if you mix in some other stuff into a mushroom paste and you kind of pack it into a log, and as long as you've gotten the liquid moisture stuff right, it'll solidify, and then you can, scoop that out, spread it on crackers. So that's a phenomenal way to eat and use up mushrooms. Certainly one of my favorites. But yeah, I think people get really kind of torn up, like, well, how do I use this mushroom, right? And if you look up most mushroom recipes, they're like, well, make a risotto, make a pasta, maybe cook them and put them on pizza, maybe cook them with eggs. Those are some very traditional ways of doing stuff. But there's so many other ways you can do it. You can take mushrooms and boil them and make a ceviche. You can put them in stir fries. You can braise with them in meat dishes. You can grind them up and mix them with meat and make burger patties with them. There's so many different possibilities, and I think people are kind of constantly asking me for recipes. I'm like, well, everything I cook has mushrooms in it. I'm not cooking a special mushroom dish. I'm just adding them to everything I do, whether it's like a cold salad or a hot dish or a dessert. I'm figuring out a way to take the mushrooms that I have in the fridge and integrate them into what I'm cooking. And I'd say with most things, you really don't need to be afraid to add mushrooms. But if you follow some of the simple steps I was talking about, kind of like sauteing them, getting fairly cooked, really developing the texture and flavor and umami of a mushroom, then you're adding it back into your other dish. You're maximizing its impact in that dish. And you want to pick mushrooms that are sort of synergistic with what you're cooking. There's certain mushrooms that have a very, very strong flavor, like a shiitake, that might not go really well with a delicate dish, but they would go really well with something else where that is enhancing all the other characteristics in there. So maybe you're cooking a fish dish. Shiitake might be too strong for like a fish dish, but something like lion's mane has a synergistic flavor and texture that would go really well with fish. Where shiitake might go really well with like braised beef and burdock root and daikon radish or something like that. So kind of look at like how mushrooms are used in cuisines around the world and figure out what would be the best way to use them for the kind of ingredients that you have on hand. And some of that is just creativity, play around, be creative, and don't be afraid of putting mushrooms in the meat. They're absolutely delicious. They're really good for you. And I could probably talk about cooking mushrooms for another hour, but I think that's about the end of the podcast. And that's a good one. So again,